Right now, the next number to move may be the gas price at your local station, because oil just fell below $100 a barrel. Meanwhile, Iranian sea mines are still floating in the Strait of Hormuz, and a single one-page deal is sitting on the table in Tehran waiting for their final answer. That sequence is not a coincidence. It is a story about how disciplined American power works when it is actually used, and how Iran's most dangerous gamble became the trap that forced it to the table. To understand where we are, you have to understand what Iran believed going into this. For years, the Iranian regime operated on a theory that had never truly been tested. It believed it could fight a permanent shadow war mine international waters, fire missiles across the region, fund proxy armies from Beirut to Baghdad, enrich uranium behind layers of military infrastructure, and still manage the pace of every crisis. Tehran thought the world would always panic before Washington would act. It thought American presidents would always weigh the cost of escalation and choose the safer exit. It thought oil markets were a lever it controlled, and the Strait of Hormuz was a gun it could hold to the throat of the global economy without anyone ever calling the bluff. That theory shaped every Iranian decision for 2 decades, and it was wrong in every direction that mattered. The first correction came from the air. Operation Epic Fury did not begin with an ultimatum. It began with strikes, and the strikes were precise about what they were trying to destroy. Not cities, not symbols, not the regime's ability to claim it was still standing. The target was something more specific: Iran's confidence in its own military machine. Several missile launch sites that had spent years pointing at American bases, Gulf oil terminals, and population centers across the region were hit hard. Defense facilities connected to drone and ballistic missile production were damaged. Key underground nuclear sites. Iran spent years and billions constructing sites the regime believed were buried deep enough to survive serious conventional pressure, were reportedly breached, exposed, and thrown into operational chaos. Secretary of State Marco Rubio described the damage in language that cut through the usual diplomatic fog. Iran's missile launching capability had been substantially degraded, its defense industrial base severely damaged, and the military shield it had spent decades building around its nuclear program had been torn open. That last point is the one most analysis missed. Iran's nuclear ambition was never purely about uranium. It was about architecture. The regime understood that a bomb alone was not enough. It needed a military machine capable of making any strike against that bomb too painful to attempt. Radars, command nodes, missile batteries, interceptors, production lines, engineers-hardened storage, and political fear all served the same purpose. The entire apparatus existed to raise the cost of intervention so high that no rational actor would pay it. America and Israel looked at that calculation and decided to break it, not by occupying Iran, not by toppling the regime overnight, but by demonstrating one undeniable fact. The machine that was supposed to make Iran untouchable was itself very touchable. That belief, once broken, does not easily rebuild. This is where military power changed the room. Before Epic Fury, Tehran believed time was on its side. It could drag out negotiations, keep enriching uranium, threaten ships, mine Hormuz, and push oil markets into fear. Then after creating enough pain, it could walk into negotiations and demand concessions like the victim. After Epic Fury, the math changed. Every Iranian move became more expensive. Fire more missiles and risk losing more launch capacity. Hide more nuclear work. And invite deeper pressure. Keep squeezing Hormuz and face a blockade that bleeds Iran before it breaks America. Keep shouting victory and explain to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps why the machine that was supposed to protect the regime is now counting losses. That is the part many people miss. Military power did not replace diplomacy. It created the conditions for real diplomacy. Weakness gets ignored, strength gets attention. A conference table means nothing if the men across from you believe they can survive every consequence. But put their launchers under pressure, their ships under watch, their oil under blockade, and their nuclear shield under threat, and diplomacy stops being theater. It becomes a survival calculation. That is why the one-page deal matters now. Without the hammer, that paper would be just another document, another delay tactic, another diplomatic fog bank for Tehran to hide inside. But after epic fury, the paper carries weight. It carries the sound of bombers. It carries the pressure of blockade. It carries the knowledge that Washington is not asking Iran for trust. Washington is demanding compliance. Then came Hormuz and the second, more consequential miscalculation. After the strikes began, Iran made a decision that looked aggressive but was actually desperate. It moved to close the Strait of Hormuz. On the surface, the logic seems sound. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and natural gas flows through that narrow channel. If Tehran could shut it down, mine the waters, terrorize commercial shipping, and hold the global energy supply hostage, it believed it held the ultimate leverage. The world would pressure Washington to stand down. Oil importing nations in Europe and Asia would line up to pressure America before they accepted the economic pain. Iran would become the indispensable gatekeeper, the country everyone had to bargain with before the lights stayed on. But Hormuz is not just a waterway, it is a confidence machine. A tanker does not move because a captain is brave. It moves because insurers accept the risk. Banks process the transaction ports, prepare the cargo, buyers trust the delivery window, and governments believe the route will remain open. Iran understood the geography, but it badly misunderstood the system built on top of that geography. The regime thought it could scare the world and still use the same shipping network to sell its own oil. That was the fatal contradiction. You cannot set fire to the hallway and then complain that your own exit is blocked. The regime did not stop at mining the water. It announced the creation of something called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a unilateral declaration that commercial ships now needed official Iranian guidance by email, prior permission before transit, and compliance with rules set in Tehran. The IRGC went further still, demanding payment in Iranian currency from vessels seeking passage and insisting that nations involved in the conflict pay war reparations before any tanker could move. In other words, Iran tried to turn one of the most critical sea lanes on Earth into a toll road it owned. That was the bluff, and Washington answered it with control. The response was a blockade posture backed by American warships, constant patrols, and Project Freedom, a direct escort operation for commercial vessels stranded by the crisis. U.S. forces reported intercepting Iranian missiles, disabling an Iranian-flagged tanker accused of blockade violations, and sinking several small IRGC boats that attempted to interfere. The message was direct. The Strait of Hormuz does not belong to any regime that plants mines in international water and writes its own transit rules. Freedom of navigation is not a request, it is a rule. And America was prepared to enforce that rule with overwhelming force. What Iran had not modeled was the asymmetry of pain. Yes, oil prices spiked hard at first. Insurance rates for tankers surged. Shipping companies rerouted or waited. The global market absorbed real disruption. But Iran had assumed America would feel that pain worse than Tehran would. That assumption collapsed when the pressure was applied in reverse. China had been purchasing nearly 90% of Iran's sanctioned oil exports. A shadow economy the regime depended on to fund the Revolutionary Guard, its proxy networks, missile production, and the domestic machinery of control. The moment the blockade tightened around those flows, Iran's revenue came under pressure in ways it could not hide and could not easily replace. Oil sales need ships. Ships need insurance. Insurance needs stable sea lanes. Stable sea lanes require international confidence. And confidence disappears the moment you start treating international water like sovereign territory. Tehran's great weapon had a fatal design flaw. To use it against the world Iran had to destroy, the same conditions that made its own economy function. That is the trap Iran built for itself. And it snapped shut faster than Tehran expected. The clearest proof came when serious negotiations finally started. President Trump paused Project Freedom. Within hours, oil prices reversed sharply and fell below $100 a barrel. The market had not been waiting for more chaos. It had been waiting for proof that the waterway might reopen and the pressure might stabilize. If that price drop holds, it moves toward American kitchen tables, lower transport pressure, reduced strain on groceries. Less inflation moving through the supply chain, and real money staying in the pockets of families heading into summer. That detail matters because Americans do not live inside foreign policy papers. They live inside monthly bills. A lower oil price means the trucker hauling produce across Interstate 40 may spend less on diesel. It means a small manufacturer in Ohio may feel less pressure from freight costs. It means a family planning a summer road trip may breathe a little easier at the pump. This is why Hormuz is never just a dot on a map. When Iran threatens that waterway, it is not only threatening tankers, it is threatening the price structure of ordinary American life. For Tehran, that same price drop was a quiet disaster. Every dollar oil falls cuts into the revenue the regime needs to finance control at home and pressure abroad. It means less room to fund proxy networks, less room to rebuild damaged facilities, less room to buy time, and less room to pretend that Hormuz was a winning card. The weapon that was supposed to hurt America first was now cutting into Iran's own oxygen. Now comes the sharpest instrument of all, not a bomb, not a blockade, a single sheet of paper. The proposed one-page memorandum sitting in Tehran is not a standard diplomatic document. It is a stress test for the regime's survival calculus. The reported 14-point outline demands that Iran halt uranium enrichment for at least 12 years, build no new underground nuclear facilities. Accept strengthened international inspections with real teeth rule out any path to a nuclear weapon. And reopen the Strait of Hormuz to all commercial traffic within 30 days of signing. In exchange, Washington has offered to lift certain sanctions and release billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets, money the regime desperately needs and currently cannot access. Iran's public response has been predictable. Officials call it an American wish list. They insist enrichment is non-negotiable. They refuse to move the approximately 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, nearly 900 pounds, currently stockpiled on Iranian soil. They talk about sovereignty resistance and the right to a peaceful nuclear program. None of that language is new. What is new is the context surrounding it. Because this is not a deal being offered from a position of American patience. It is being offered from a position of demonstrated American willingness to use force, sustain a blockade, absorb oil market pain, and walk away from a bad outcome rather than paper over it. President Trump has been direct: accept a deal and the war ends. Refuse and the bombs can return. Tehran has already seen what that looks like in practice. Launch sites torn apart, factories damaged. The nuclear shield cracked open. The hammer is not a metaphor, it is still in the room. Which is why the real negotiation happening right now is not only between diplomats. It is happening inside Iranian leadership itself, between the faction that understands the math and the faction that cannot afford to be seen accepting it. Between Iran's pride and Iran's survival. That internal conflict is the most dangerous variable in the equation because regimes under this kind of pressure do not always make rational decisions. They sometimes make theatrical ones. They sometimes choose the collapse of their military and economic position over the political humiliation of a managed retreat because the men making the decision are more afraid of their own hardliners than of Washington. That is the risk America is managing with this paper, and it is worth naming honestly. Still, the structure of Iran's choices is unusually clear. Sign the deal and accept limits the regime spent years insisting it would never accept losing the nuclear shadow and the Hormuz threat in the same moment, but keeping the apparatus of government intact. Reject the deal and invite the return of strikes, deeper blockade, and a revenue crisis the economy cannot absorb indefinitely. Or delay, which is the option Iran has historically preferred. Except that delay now costs something concrete every single day in oil revenue, in degraded military capacity, and in the slow erosion of what remains of the shield. This is why the one-page deal is so dangerous for Tehran. It does not merely ask Iran to stop. It asks Iran to accept being watched. It asks a regime built on ambiguity to live under verification. It asks leaders who survive by controlling information to let outsiders measure their most sensitive program. For Washington, that is the point. Trust is useless here. Limits matter only when they can be checked. And a deal that cannot be verified is not peace. It is just another pause before the next crisis. There is no version of this where Iran comes out with more than it had before the mines went into the water. That window closed when the first American strike hit. What Tehran is negotiating now is not advantage. It is the terms of its own limitation. And the longer it waits to accept that reality, the fewer terms it will be in a position to shape. The mullahs built their strategy around one foundational belief that America would always find the cost of confrontation too high. That belief drove every decision the mines, the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the reparations demands, the enrichment acceleration, the proxy escalations. Strip it away, and what remains is not a strong regime playing a long game. It is a government that gambled its military infrastructure, its oil revenue, its international shipping access, and its remaining diplomatic leverage on a theory about American weakness, and lost every bet on the same table. Iran wanted to turn a narrow strip of water into the most powerful weapon in the Middle East. America turned that same strip of water into the mechanism now forcing Tehran to choose between a controlled retreat and a deeper collapse. That is not a coincidence of timing. That is what happens when a state mistakes patience for weakness and discovers too late that the patience was simply preparation. The question tonight is not whether Iran feels the pressure. The signals are unmistakable. The question is whether the men in Tehran can separate their survival from their pride fast enough to take the exit that is still available. Because the exit has a deadline, and the next chapter, if they miss it, will not be written in conference rooms. It will be written in the cold arithmetic of a regime that ran out of options, one bad decision at a time, and finally ran out of time.